The crack echoed like a gunshot across the dusty main street of Clearwater, Idaho. Rachel Rowland's wagon lurched violently to one side, the rear wheels splintering into jagged pieces that scattered across the hard-packed earth. She gripped the reins as her horse stamped nervously, dust rising in choking clouds around them both. Calvin James stood 30 feet away, one boot propped on the hitching post outside the saloon. He watched the wagon collapse with the steady gaze of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. His hand rested near his holster, not threatening, just ready. Rachel climbed down slowly, her gray dress covered in trail dust, her face lined with exhaustion that went deeper than the journey. She was 55 years old and looked every day of it. The town watched from doorways and windows, curious but unwilling to help. "I need shelter," Rachel called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Just for the night. I can pay." Calvin pushed off the post and walked toward her, his spurs chinking softly. He stopped a few feet away, studying her face, then the broken wagon, then the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "You asked where you'd sleep tonight," he said quietly. "The answer might cost you more than money." Thunder rumbled in the distance. If you've ever felt abandoned when you needed help most, then staying matters more than you know. Let us know where you're watching from. Your presence keeps stories like Rachel's alive. What did Calvin mean? Calvin James had arrived in Clearwater 6 months earlier with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a past he refused to discuss. The townsfolk whispered that he'd ridden with outlaws down in Wyoming, that he'd killed 3 men in a single night, that he was running from something darker than the law. None of it was entirely true. None of it was entirely false. He'd taken work at the livery stable, breaking horses that other men couldn't handle. He slept in the hayloft, ate alone and spoke only when necessary. Women tried to catch his eye. He looked through them like glass. Men tried to provoke him. He walked away every time. Until the day he couldn't. 2 weeks before Rachel's arrival, a drunk ranch hand had cornered a young woman behind the general store. Calvin had intervened with 3 precise movements: a twist of the wrist, a knee to the gut, and the drunk face down in the dirt before he could draw breath to scream. Sheriff Dalton had watched from across the street. He hadn't arrested Calvin, but his eyes had narrowed with recognition, as if he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. Now, as Calvin stood before Rachel's broken wagon, he felt that same weight of scrutiny. The sheriff was watching from his office window, fingers drumming against the glass. Calvin turned back to Rachel. "Follow me." But as they walked toward the edge of town, a voice called out. Rachel Rowland had lost her husband 18 months ago to a fever that swept through their homestead like wildfire. Thomas Rowland had been a stubborn, silent man, but he'd worked the land with devotion, turning barren Idaho soil into something that could almost be called a farm. When he died, Rachel discovered the debts. Equipment bought on credit, seed borrowed against future harvests, promises made to men who collected with interest that multiplied like locusts. She'd sold everything that wasn't nailed down, furniture, livestock, even her wedding ring, and still owed more than she could earn in 5 years. Then came the rumors. A prospector passing through had spent one night drunk at her barn, sheltering from a storm. Before he left, he'd drawn a crude map on a scrap of paper and pressed it into her hand. "Your land sits on something valuable," he'd whispered. "Not gold. Better than gold in this desert hell." He'd died 3 days later, thrown from his horse in a canyon. The map showed a marker somewhere on Rachel's property, an X scratched near the base of what looked like a distinctive rock formation. She'd searched for weeks, found nothing, and eventually dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man. But others had heard the rumor too. Marcus Krell, a land speculator from Boise, had offered to buy her property at a fraction of its value. When she refused, men began appearing at odd hours, watching from the tree line, testing her fences. Now she stood in Clearwater with a broken wagon and nowhere to go. Calvin gestured toward a small cabin at the edge of town. "You can stay." A gunshot split the air. Sheriff William Dalton stood in the center of the street, his revolver pointed at the sky, smoke curling from the barrel. His badge caught the fading sunlight like a warning. "Calvin James," he called out. "I need a word." Calvin's hand moved instinctively toward his holster, then stopped. Rachel stood frozen beside him, her eyes darting between the two men. Dalton lowered his weapon slowly, deliberately. "I ain't arresting nobody. Yet. Just want to know why you're taking such an interest in Mrs. Rowland here." He shifted his gaze to Rachel. "And I want to know what you're really doing in Clearwater, ma'am." Rachel's voice came out steadier than she felt. "My wagon broke. I asked for shelter. That's all." "That's all?" Dalton walked closer, his boots crunching on the broken wheel fragments. "Funny thing. I received a telegram this morning from Boise. Seems Marcus Krell is offering a reward for information about a certain widow traveling with a map showing something valuable on her property." Rachel's face went pale. Calvin stepped forward slightly, putting himself between Rachel and the sheriff. "She doesn't have to answer your questions." "Maybe not." Dalton smiled without warmth. "But those men riding into town right now, they might not be as patient as I am." Rachel and Calvin turned to see 3 riders cresting the hill, their horses moving fast, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Calvin's voice dropped to a whisper. "You have that map." Rachel's silence was answer enough. The riders were getting closer. The first drops of rain hit like thrown stones. Within seconds, the sky opened up with a fury that turned the street into a churning river of mud. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the 3 riders who'd now reached the edge of town, their horses stamping and snorting in the deluge. Calvin grabbed Rachel's arm. "Move! Now!" They ran toward the cabin as thunder shook the ground beneath their feet. Calvin kicked the door open, pulled Rachel inside, and slammed it shut just as one of the riders shouted something lost in the roar of the storm. The cabin was small, a single room with a potbelly stove, a narrow bed, and a table with 2 chairs. Rain hammered the roof like rifle fire. Water began seeping under the door. Rachel leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, her wet dress clinging to her thin frame. Calvin moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass at the shapes moving outside. "They won't come in during the storm," he said. "Too much mud, too little visibility. But come morning." "I know." Rachel's voice was hollow. She reached into her coat and pulled out a leather-bound diary, its pages swollen with moisture. "This is what they want." Calvin turned sharply. "That's the map?" "No." Rachel opened the diary with trembling hands. "This belonged to my husband. He wrote everything in here. Where he dug wells, where he planted crops, where he found things he couldn't explain." She pointed to a page covered in dense handwriting, including this. Calvin read the passage, his expression changing from confusion to shock. "If you've ever discovered a truth that could destroy you or save you, then you understand why staying matters. Let us know where you're watching from, because some secrets need witnesses to survive." Outside, a horse screamed in the darkness. Thomas Rowland's handwriting was cramped and urgent, as if he'd written in fear of forgetting. "Found it today. The spring that feeds the whole valley. It rises from bedrock 50 feet below the surface, pure and cold. Enough water to turn every dead farm from here to Boise into gardens. Enough to make this territory bloom. Enough to make men kill. Calvin read the coordinates twice. This is on your land? Rachel nodded. Thomas tried to tell the town council. They laughed at him, said he was addled from sun sickness. But he kept digging, kept searching, trying to prove it. Her voice broke. The fever took him before he could finish. And now Krell knows. Calvin closed the diary. Or suspects. That's why he wants your property. Not just him. Rachel moved to the window. Through the rain she could see lights moving. More riders arriving. More men drawn by rumors of water in a land where water meant power. Calvin, I need to know something. He turned to face her. That night in Wyoming, she said quietly. The one you won't talk about. Were you running from the law? Or from yourself? The question hung in the air like smoke. Calvin's jaw tightened. Both. Lightning flashed, and in that brief moment of illumination, Rachel saw something in his face. Not just haunting, but recognition. He understood what it meant to carry a secret that could drown you. I killed a man, Calvin said softly. He was a rancher stealing water from homesteaders, damming up streams, letting families die of thirst while his cattle drank their fill. I shot him in front of his men. Nobody arrested me because nobody wanted to. But his family hired hunters. You're still running. Every day. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and the door exploded inward. Sheriff Dalton stood in the doorway, rain streaming from his hat, his revolver drawn, but pointed at the floor. Behind him, the 3 riders waited on horseback, their faces still hidden. I'm sorry, Calvin, Dalton said, and the regret in his voice sounded genuine. But Marcus Krell owns this town's debt same as he owns everyone else's. He sent word. I bring him Rachel Rowland and that diary, or he calls in every loan from here to Boise. This town dies. Calvin's hand hovered near his holster. You're better than this. Maybe I was. Dalton stepped inside, water pooling around his boots. But better doesn't feed my children. Mrs. Rowland, I'll need that diary. Rachel clutched it to her chest. It's not just water, she said desperately. It's survival for everyone. If Krell controls the spring, he controls the entire territory. He'll sell water at prices that destroy families. I know. Dalton's voice was dead. But if I don't give it to him, he destroys this family first. Mine. He gestured to the riders. These men work for Krell. They're here to make sure I follow through. One of the riders dismounted and pushed into the cabin. He pulled back his hat, revealing a face Calvin recognized. Jake Morrison, a bounty hunter from Wyoming. The man who'd been tracking him for 18 months. Morrison smiled. Hello, Calvin. Funny meeting you here. Calvin went still. This isn't about me. It is now. Morrison's hand rested on his gun. I take you back to Wyoming, collect my bounty. Dalton takes the diary, saves his town. Everybody wins. His smile widened. Except you two. The second rider appeared in the doorway. Rachel gasped. It was Marcus Krell himself. Marcus Krell was a small man with expensive clothes and eyes like frozen coins. He stepped carefully around the puddles, keeping his polished boots clean even as rain lashed through the open door. Mrs. Rowland, he said pleasantly, we keep meeting under unfortunate circumstances. You followed me, Rachel's voice shook with fury. You've been hunting me since I left the farm. Protecting my investment. Krell gestured to Morrison. Mr. Morrison here was already tracking Calvin for other reasons. When I learned you two had connected, it seemed providential. 2 problems, 1 solution. He held out his hand. The diary, please. Calvin shifted his weight, calculating distances. Morrison's gun was drawn. Dalton's was still lowered but ready. The third rider remained outside, blocking any escape through the door. You can't sell water, Rachel said. It belongs to the land, to everyone who needs it. Water belongs to whoever controls it. Krell's pleasant tone never wavered. I'll develop the spring, build the infrastructure, create a distribution system. For a reasonable price, of course. Everyone benefits. Except they can't afford your prices. Then they shouldn't have settled in a desert. Krell's patience was wearing thin. Last chance, Mrs. Rowland. The diary and the deed to your property. In exchange, I'll pay enough to cover your husband's debts and set you up comfortably in Sacramento. You'll never have to work again. Rachel looked at the diary in her hands, then at Calvin. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding, a shared recognition of the moment when you either surrender or fight. She made her choice. No. Krell nodded once. Mr. Morrison, take them both. But as Morrison moved forward, Calvin's hand flashed to his holster, and the cabin exploded with the roar of gunfire. Calvin's shot took Morrison's hat clean off his head. The bounty hunter dove behind the table as Calvin grabbed Rachel and pulled her toward the back wall. Wood splintered as return fire tore through the cabin. Sheriff Dalton raised his weapon, hesitated, then slowly lowered it again. I can't, he whispered. I can't do this. Krell's face went purple with rage. You'll do what you're paid to do, or what? Dalton turned on him. You'll destroy my town? You're destroying it anyway, buying up water, bleeding people dry, turning us into your slaves. He looked at Calvin. Get her out of here. Morrison fired twice. One bullet caught Dalton in the shoulder, spinning him around. The sheriff went down hard, his gun sliding across the wet floor. The third rider burst through the door, and Calvin fired again, forcing him back into the rain. Rachel threw the potbelly stove's door open and shoved the diary inside, into the dying embers. No! Krell lunged forward, but the diary was already burning, pages curling and blackening. The coordinates, Rachel shouted over the chaos. I memorized them. You want the spring? You'll have to let us live long enough to find it. Morrison and the third rider exchanged glances. Krell stood frozen, watching his leverage turn to ash. Calvin backed toward the shattered doorway, Rachel beside him. Rain and darkness waited outside. Their only chance. You'll never make it, Morrison called. I tracked Calvin across 3 states. I'll find you in 3 hours. Calvin smiled grimly. Then I guess we better run fast. They disappeared into the storm as gunfire erupted behind them, and the night swallowed them whole. But morning would come, and with it, the final reckoning. Dawn broke cold and clear over Rachel's property. The storm had passed, leaving the land scrubbed and raw. Calvin and Rachel stood at the base of a towering rock formation that matched Thomas Rowland's description perfectly, 3 fingers of stone reaching toward the sky like a desperate prayer. They'd ridden through the night using game trails and creek beds to hide their tracks. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, Morrison and Krell's men were still searching. Here, Rachel said, pointing to a natural depression in the ground. Thomas wrote about a hollow that echoed when you stamped on it. Calvin knelt and pressed his ear to the earth. Beneath the surface he heard it, the unmistakable whisper of moving water. Deep, powerful, endless. They dug with their hands until their fingers bled, clearing away rocks and soil until water suddenly burst through, cold and pure, bubbling up from ancient bedrock. It flowed into the depression, then spilled over, creating a stream that cut through the dry earth like a vein of silver. Rachel knelt beside the spring, tears streaming down her face. He was right. Thomas was right all along. "It's enough water for the whole valley," Calvin said quietly. "Enough to change everything." "Then we share it." Rachel looked up at him. "Not sell it. Share it. Every homesteader, every small farm, every family that needs it. Free." Calvin studied her face. This 55-year-old widow who'd lost everything and chose generosity anyway. He thought about Wyoming, about running, about the man he'd killed and the man he'd become. "Where will you sleep tonight?" he asked softly. Rachel understood the question beneath the question. "Right here," she said. "On my land, in my home, where I belong." She paused. "Unless you're still running." Calvin looked at the spring, at the water flowing free and clear into the thirsty earth. He thought about Dalton, wounded but alive, who'd chosen courage at the last moment, about towns that could bloom if given the chance, about the difference between taking and giving. "I'm done running," he said. By afternoon they'd filed claim to the water rights under territorial law, not for ownership, but for protection and equal